get ready to begin. Thank you all for staying so long. It's been a long and very exciting 2 days. And we're going to begin our final panel discussion, Liminal Places, Cultures, and Powers. Here, there, why should we care? Oh, that rhymes. Implications for politics, research, and pedagogies. I think that we'll start off by introducing our new panelists. We have Leo Vasquez, professor at the Blasteen School of Planning and Public Policy at Rutgers University. He is well regarded for his expertise on diversity in the planning profession. He is a founder of Planners for Ethics and Cultural Diversity, the largest group of its kind in the planning profession, and a founder of Latinos in Planning, a network of more than 200 planning and community development professionals. So that's very exciting. We are also privileged to have René Francisco Putevin, assistant professor from New York University. He's a sociologist by training and holds intellectual interests in the area of local labor markets, gentrification, race, and ethnicity in the United States. His courses include urban space and resistance, mapping for social change, Latinos in the politics, race in the United States, and gentrification and its discontents. He is currently doing research on undocumented Latino workers and the social regulation of local labor markets. We're also welcoming back our earlier panel moderators, Tom Ngati from Hunter College, Jorge Otero Payos from here at Columbia University, and Tatiana Shore, who I actually don't know where she comes from, so. From the Federal University of Amazonas. So we are really excited. Over the past 2 days, we've been extremely lucky to share a diverse range of research about emergent transnational relationships and identities, from art exhibitions in New York to mega projects in ex-urban Mexico to public spaces in Barcelona to music subcultures in Japan. This conference has illuminated for us the importance and breadth of transnational Latin Americanisms. But the question really here, which Claudia alluded to earlier in our previous panel, is, so what? That is, after all we've learned about all these interesting and complex case studies presented in these 2 days at the conference, what are some of the first thoughts that the panelists might comment on that come to their minds as they contemplate the implications for politics, research, or pedagogies? I would like each of you to take about 2 minutes. Thank you. Sure. What are some of the, it's a very open-ended question, what are some of the first thoughts that come to your mind as you contemplate implications for politics, research, and pedagogies in transnational Latin Americanisms? Based on the papers that we heard or otherwise. Is anybody ready to begin? 2 minutes to think, okay.
Okay. Well, I guess
Okay.
I'll start this off. Can everybody hear me, or do I need the microphone?
Use microphone.
Oh, we use the microphone because we're recording. Okay. Just to let you know a little bit about where my perspective is coming from, Latinos in Planning is the largest organization of planners focused on planning in Latino communities. And most of our members are Latino themselves, although not all of them. And we've heard a number of, over the past 3 years, we conducted a number of diálogos where we asked planners specifically, what are the biggest planning challenges facing Latino communities? And the 2 biggest planning challenges relate to public participation of Latinos in the planning process, and the second one is about the way planners engage with Latino communities now. And I think one of the, what the growth of transnational communities in the United States does is it really creates almost an existential challenge for the planning profession about how planners do their work, which traditionally has been focused on regulating land uses, really a management mindset. Working with transnational communities requires being more open to diversity, quite frankly, more open to chaos and tension that occurs when you have multiple communities, and then the integration of those multiple communities creating really new sub-communities, because people have multiple identities as they move in their lives and they live in another place. So I think the challenge is, one of the challenges is how planners work with Latino communities, how planners think about what their job is. And I think the challenge is going to be not just thinking about regulating land use, which has had certain failures, but thinking about how do you integrate, how do you value difference, how do you make it work within regulatory structures that, for the most part, are focused on, still focused on segregation and restrictions of land uses. The other thing that I would say is focus on economic development. What transnational communities do is really they are a key to globalization. And where this really has an impact on the ground is in the uses of commercial space. Specifically, I would say industrial space and warehousing space. Now, I live and work in New Jersey, and we have a lot of older, smaller industrial spaces that many of them are being converted into either residential or retail spaces. Yet, many of those spaces could very well be used and are being used as avenues for import, export. For example, an ethnic community brings in raw materials into Port Newark. It gets shipped over into what's considered an obsolete industrial warehousing facility. Those parts get assembled and then they get sold in those ethnic communities. So one of the keys there, the lesson there is protecting those older industrial spaces, even though we are led to believe that they would be better off being converted into housing, retail, lofts, etc.
Thank you.
More than 2 minutes.
That's perfect.
No, I can't be the only one speaking.
Yeah, go ahead, Tom.
Okay, so this way, the two planners, we'll do our thing and then we'll let other folks get in. I really appreciate the tenor of the panels in the way that they deal with the complexity of issues and the ambiguity of public spaces. And I think this is something that's very important in an interdisciplinary conference and discussion and in transnational environments. So I think this is really important and an important lesson that I got from listening to the discussions today. But I'm looking for some more clarity, and I think it's necessary to, at the risk of being called structuralist or determinist or narrow, look for determination. And I felt a relief when I heard Teresa say in the last panel that labor and capital were involved, and that the mobility of labor and capital had a good deal to do and helped to explain the complexities and ambiguities of what we're talking about. There is also a tendency in my profession and among architects and those who deal with the physical environment to be physical determinists and to place the physical environment over economic relations or social relations. And I would say that neither solely an economic or a physical view by itself is helpful, but we need to go deeper, I think, and look at the connections. I thought the case of Plaza Mexico was actually very telling, because it showed how little the physical design of the space was determining the social use, the actual use of the space. That, to me, seemed to be one of the most important lessons. And it affects our discussions about the preservation of urban spaces. Too much, we in the design professions pretend that our designs shape human relations, when in practice we have a lot to learn about how human relations shape the form of public spaces and the form of cities. And you know, when I hear finally somebody mentioned NAFTA, how to explain the flows of labor and capital without NAFTA, and the dramatic changes that occur both in Mexico and the United States, and that are occurring in every country in Latin America as the result of free trade. Because it's been on a very unequal process, where capital has had all the freedom and labor has had very little. Where labor gets stopped at the border, so when you talk about bounded tourism, what? You explain that by NAFTA. Because NAFTA, the whole idea of NAFTA was complete freedom for capital, almost complete, and restriction of the movements of labor. Also, I think it's, there's one thing missing in the discussion of what's going on in the United States, in Latino communities in the United States. And that is the long, and this is what's happening in academia especially, is the long historical, theoretical debate between assimilationism and transnationalism, for want of a better term. The assimilationist approach has dominated the idea of the melting pot right from the beginning. And I don't think you begin to understand the bounded transnationalism until you understand the extent to which the assimilationist politics, actually, even in New York City, a city which is quite diverse, has people from nationalities all over the world, and despite the fact that Spanish is spoken everywhere, there are children in New York City schools who will be disciplined for speaking Spanish. There are children in New York City schools who are disciplined for speaking Arabic. The dominant, the
That was
hegemonic
about
notion.
2 minutes, Tom,
Oh,
sorry.
okay, sorry.
Just
Is
wrap it up.
still English monolingual and monocultural. The standard is still the monocultural standard, and that's what the U.S. and Mexico and the U.S. and Latin America means. It doesn't just mean American culture; it's the monoculture. And then I'll end with the one last question that occurred to me during the discussion, which I think would be an interesting discussion. Is, can you imagine ever Walmart doing something like Plaza Mexico? That says something about the freedom of global capital and the monoculture of global capital and how it is shaping cities throughout the world.
Thank you.
Thinking about pedagogical and research agendas, I tend to agree with Clara. I think it's time that we take from the Latin American studies or the Brazilian studies the thematic of Latin Americanism and let it permeate all other disciplines, especially in my case when we study urbanization. It is very important to understand how it is so intertwined into the urban tissue that it cannot be separated as something different from the whole of the city. As the Plaza Mexico example said, it tells us much more about LA than about what is in fact Mexican culture or Mexican heritage is being reinterpreted by Transnational. Also, what Clara said about multi-sited research I think is very interesting, because it is a time that we should see a little bit more of ping-ponging, not only of the influence of Latin Americanisms with relation to the US, but also Latin Americanism in Latin America. And then we should, the talk about the Bolivians in Sao Paulo, the Bolivians in Buenos Aires, or the Colombian doctors which occupy all the medical posts in the Solimões in the Amazon. We don't have Brazilian doctors, we have Colombian and Peruvian doctors. And how do these all relate with the trafficking of humans through the Amazon up Venezuela into Spain? And how does this relate to the Spanish woman, or the work we saw about Latin American women living by themselves in cities like Madrid, with comparison to the Moroccan woman which live with their families? And how can we interpret these fluxes in a much more dynamic, transnational perspective? I think a possible agenda could include these themes. And I think also that there is, pointed out something interesting, is a bit of sociology of science, of what are the Latin American academics which are now in the US, be them native Latin Americans, be them Americans in general. What have they been studying? How has it been organized? And what are the themes that have appeared in the last 20, 25 years, maybe 30 years? And how do these thematics lead to different directions and discussions which could be more opened to other disciplines which are not specifically Latin American studies, like planning?
Well, I thought it was a fabulous conference. I had a great time listening to all the papers, and my brain was stimulated continuously. I mean, without caffeine, actually, I was doing pretty well just with the presentations, which is, you know, quite amazing for a 2-day conference where you're, you know, it's hard to keep up. And in terms of pedagogy, you know, I thought that this is really quite relevant to what's happening in universities today, where the question of interdisciplinarity was so important, you know, at one point began in the humanities, and now all of a sudden, the minute that the sciences have begun to realize that the only way to advance science is to really begin to work across departments, now the universities are, in a sense, waking up to the idea of interdisciplinary in a serious way and funding it. And so you're seeing, in a sense, schools, I wouldn't say falling apart, but being restructured by the setup of institutions that are drawing professors from different fields in order to try to address certain problems. And they're, you know, they're creating institutes or, you know, research facilities of sorts. And the real question is, what is relevant? What are the relevant problems of our day, and what are relevant questions? You know, what is the relevant knowledge that we need to bring to the table in order to address those problems? And certainly, it seems to me that this is one of the major issues of our day, is this problem of globalization and transnational realities, and this problem precisely of capital versus labor freedom. But also, I think that one of the things that we have come to realize during the presentations is that we have to rethink ourselves as academics. We have to rethink our own disciplines. I'm working within historic preservation. We have to really begin to kind of go to square one, in a sense. Historic preservation works on the assumption that the way that one regulates a historic environment is based on notions of stylistic integrity. You know, this is the way we kind of come to decisions as to what is valuable or not. I mean, these are obsolete terms. We cannot continue to function in this way if we are really to take seriously the learnings that we are kind of engaging in conferences like this. because if, let's say, only capital circulates, and as you know, Gayatri Spivak is fond of saying this, only capital circulates and the rest is damage control, then some of the kinds of damage control that we do as academics is more damage than anything, you know, is it contributing to the damage. So in rethinking our disciplines, I think that we would need to not fall back on the post-war model of a kind of extended multiculturalism, you know, which is the, and maybe that's a little bit what I was hearing on when you were saying a kind of, we cannot be monoculture, we have to, I maybe ask you to qualify that, but I think we are on the same page on that. But I think that we cannot follow the model of this kind of extended multiculturalism and really rethink ourselves in different terms. I don't know what those terms might be. It might be the transnational, although that is a term that has its own history. But I think the implications for pedagogy is that in teaching our classes, we need to really begin to break down certain boundaries that have been created in the university in order to solve previous problems. So preservation was formed, for example, as an academic discipline as a way to solve problems that are not necessarily here anymore. And so we're still kind of producing solutions to a problem that is obsolete. So we're creating the problem in order to solve it in some ways. And so to try to bring in, I think we need to, and it's hard to do that because people are tenured and, you know, how do you bring in new people, you know, well, adjuncts are a way to you know, new lines and so on. But creating, I think, arrangements by virtue of which we can have access to each other's knowledge is important. The first steps are conferences like this, where we actually sit down in a room and listen to what other people are doing. Very rarely would somebody in preservation listen to somebody in geography or anthropology, and likewise, I think, very rarely would an anthropologist give a preservationist 20 minutes of their time. So this is, you know, already quite important. I think the next step is to do joint projects, you know, joint academic projects, joint studio projects in which we challenge each other. And it would seem to me that each of the papers that were presented lend themselves to be really incredible academic exercise, and we saw some already. You know, Rosa Cervera's project, I thought, was an excellent one in which, you know, the students were really beginning to confront these issues. And I think maybe the kind of larger theme there is also what has happened to the public sphere in terms of these questions, you know, because part of the issue that we talk about in thinking what role do cities play in the public sphere, what role do media networks play in the public sphere, what role does the internet play in the public sphere? I think that you know, I'm thinking back of Hannah Arendt's notion of the public sphere as a kind of based on speech acts and communication. You know, I think a lot of what we saw was types of public spheres that were not necessarily based on speech acts, that were based on performative actions and so on, that were more difficult to analyze and more difficult to understand because nobody's verbalizing them. And so a lot of the task of the intellectual work that is happening here is to begin to be able to express that in a way that helps us that are outside of those practices, in a sense, begin to understand them and see how they can translate. So I guess, you know, I don't have a clear answer, but I just, you know, I think it's a kind of it's a process whereby, you know, the institutions that we work in today, the universities, are somehow in the way of our ability to do this kind of work.
Perfect.
Because of, yeah.
Irene.
Yes, thank you. I want to say thank you for let me start by saying thank you for the opportunity to participate, and to thank Clara for putting this very energizing and interesting conference together. What I would like to highlight then is some of the political implications that came to mind as I listened to some of the presentations today. And I want to do that through a triangulation. So on the one hand, we have this wealth of transnational Latino migration, and we had a chance to look at many permutations. But I want to counterpose some of our points today with, I want to highlight the notion of the state also, like, you know, the transnational Latino migration vis-a-vis the role of the state. And someone asked earlier, which is like a very sharp question, you know, is it fair to say like the label immigrant, like the category immigrant is actually useless? You know, we want to also could ask the question, is the term Latino also, you know, useless? Like at the end of the day, you know, we're really dealing with human beings trying to make ends meet and so on and so forth. When you turn on the state switch, you know, as I said, like, you know, and then we start to see that people start to getting round up or like targeted for state repression because of where they come from or the language they speak or like racial profiling and so on. So to me, the answer to the question is, are these terms irrelevant or not? You know, well, there's a way in which they are very relevant in terms of the politics of language and the way we label certain populations. And that doesn't take away from the individual aspect of, like, you know, like there's this other stuff going on. But I guess to paraphrase Clara earlier when she was making her point, it is both ways. There's a way in which these labels are not necessarily that useful in accounting for this other stuff, but there's a way in which we must understand the role of the state in racializing Latinos. And so, which is for me, that transition from Latin America to Latinos, it is mediated by the state. It's the state that racializes these populations by labeling them and targeting them, both in terms of repression and in terms of positive reinforcement and so on. So I just want to highlight the role of the state. But I also want to, and more importantly for me, is that this conversation is happening against a background of invisibility. There's a way in which Latinos are still very much invisible in the US public imagination. And I always like to use the example of a movie that came out a few years ago. It was called The Day After Tomorrow. How many people have seen it? It's a movie about like some tsunami that destroys like New York City like in 2003 or something. So when I saw that movie, I'm like, that's impossible. Yeah, that could never happen. And my friends are like, no, global warming. I'm like, I have no problems with the tsunami. I can see the tsunami. But my question is, how could you have the end of the world in New York City and not see any Latinos? And so it's actually a very wide movie in sort of which of course is unthinkable. Like, you know, you would be here and they, ay Dios mío, you know, they're running back and forth. But for me, this is actually an example of popular culture that where it actually takes the pulse of where the Latinos are vis-a-vis this broader background of mainstream society that needs to be, so this is the triangulation that I want to pose as a way to sort of highlight what are the political challenges for this research of transnational migration and what are the implications. And I want to highlight two more areas of conflict and challenges in which Latinos profoundly disrupt our understanding of American identity. You know, there's a very quantitative aspect to it, just by sheer numbers. But there's also a deeper aspect that actually the question of transnational migration points at the forefront of the conversation. And we have this schizophrenia of migration policy in the US, where like on the one hand, we have to let undocumented labor into the country because otherwise the economy cannot survive, and this is accepted both on the left and the right. But at the same time, we have to criminalize them because it is in that othering that we get to define ourselves as Americans. So we are not like those people over there who like quinceañeras and, you know, don't want to speak English and so on and so forth. So this is the distinctions to me that I want to sort of highlight through this conversation of transnationalism. So what does it mean? Because when you look at the Mega Marcha in 2006, okay, so you get this dialectics, like on the one hand, you see these incredible examples of solidarity and social movements that go hand in hand with this incredible increase in state repression and anti-immigrant sentiment. And to me, this is the head-on collision that we have to find a way to deal with in terms of research, in terms of pedagogy and teaching, but also politically on the ground. And I hope like this, and so thank you for this kind of spaces because we need more of this. So thank you, I'm going to say.
Thank you so much to all of you. I think that in the last couple of minutes, a lot of really important questions have been raised. I think in the spirit of making this more of an open discussion, we're going to open it up to the audience, bearing in mind that our panelists have emphasized the use of transdisciplinary alliances to address our commitment to social and spatial inclusion in what we've sort of framed as the just city, or our vision of the just city. So some really important new issues have been raised. I think it would be great if we had some more dialogue from new people. I know a lot of people have been sitting here for a few days, and they probably have a lot of questions. A lot of the panels, unfortunately, didn't allow so much time for discussion. So I will take questions whenever you start raising your hands. Yes, Marcella.
Yeah, I would like to ask Professor Angotti a little bit about what you started to say about overdeterminism. Yeah, and I think that it also touches on something that we were talking about with Renee. And this is the question that applies for all of us who are trying to think about the problems that have been discussed during 2 days here. What are the theoretical frameworks upon which we are trying to approach these problems that I agree with Clara are almost the same, that we keep facing? And how can we make a call for a stronger theoretical reflection? And I think overdeterminism comes into the question of it's a central point into that theoretical reflection. It's a determinism of power, is overdeterminism of capital and economic factors is what. So I wanted to ask you a little bit, because you said, well, in the past we used to fall into the overdeterminisms of economic figures, and yes, they're here, but we probably agree that we are not overdetermined of that. It's very much trendy to speak about overdeterminism of power structures. I don't know, Renee. I probably would like to ask some of you what about that.
But can I just clarify? I think I never used the term overdeterminism. I think it's important politically, if we as scholars are going to intervene in the real world, in a political world, with social movements, with political movements, we're dealing with questions of immigration, dealing with questions of public space, and the various struggles all over, that once we've overanalyzed something, which we always do as intellectuals, we have to step back and say, what are the political questions? And how can we clarify what's going on? And at a certain point, we have to make some determinations ourselves. What's most important? What is actually occurring in the phenomena that we're looking at? Because we have to interpret it in a way that people can use it. So if people are struggling over the use of space, you know, there are invariably determining factors. And I think one of the positive aspects of postmodernism is it helped to break down some of the old cobwebs of structuralism, but one of the negative things was it left out determination entirely. And you can never conclude anything And I'm sorry, if you're involved in any political struggles, you don't have the luxury of endless circular reasoning and discussing the complexities and going around in circles. People have to make decisions about what to do. And that's basically, it's politics. You have to decide what to do, and you have to make decisions about what are the most important factors, what are the priorities. And that's why I think economics and politics are often the determining factors. They determine much about our social lives, but not everything. And that was the problem with extreme structuralism, of course, that it threw everything else out and said that there's only one determinant. But you know, bottom line is, and this is what, and we have to be able to have these conversations with people across languages and cross cultures who also have different concepts of what determination is, or even don't even have a concept of determination. You know, so if you look at the dialogues in the World Social Forum, this is one of the problems between European philosophy and other philosophies in the world. So I think we have, but if we think about it politically, it helps to clarify.
Well, I mean, I think that for Marcela brought a really interesting point yesterday precisely on this, that it's certainly, I mean, part of the work that we do is to analyze situations, and sometimes we find double binds. But that the notion of strategic essentialism is one that takes into account our knowledge of the full complexity of a situation, and yet allows us to act without, in full consciousness of what we're doing. And sometimes precisely to make allegiances that were unsuspected in some way in the purpose of trying to get something accomplished, or in the process of get something accomplished, but then allows us also to reconstitute a more, let's say, equitable political sphere after that goal has been accomplished, and maybe rethink and move outside of that strategic essentialism once that has been, once that particular goal has been accomplished. So I think that, you know, some let's say some openings were made in that direction. What I think is also very interesting about what you were saying is that that strategic essentialism is not bottom up, and sometimes in the best interest of a just society, but that sometimes the state simply essentializes and racializes, and those are two different realities and two different processes, and somehow our role is to begin to distinguish them and to take them apart.
Well, I think related to those comments, for those of, when we're looking at the policy professions, whether they be planning, the design professions, historic preservation, etc., I think the challenge is to move from a management mindset to more of a leadership mindset. And by that I mean that the management mindset is focused on managing complexity. And that leads to the oversimplification of the other. The leadership mindset is about managing change and being open to diversity, is being open to basically allowing for change to happen and letting that be okay. One of the things that we have, as I think one of the challenges in the design professions, is everything is so programmed. You know, our focus is on programming uses, whether it's in architectural or economics. And so what we've seen in some examples that we talked about is that you really can't program uses, that the best uses grow organically. But of course, the realpolitik here is you can't just say to elected officials, well, let's just put it out there and see what happens. There has to be some direction. So that I think is the key challenge, and I agree that the only way it's going to really happen is through an interdisciplinary approach where people from different professions are challenged to think in different ways about the same problems.
Thank you. I think that we might be ready to move on to a new question if there's one. I think there's one right there.
I'm taking the occasion to thank Lucia for a great job with the reservation of the hotels and everything, and for passing me the microphone. Actually, it's interesting to me to see that in order to hear about Latin American, I had to take an international class. So that relates a little bit to your comment about the day after. So it's unreal. But my question is really why planners are not really more exposed to the real life, and it's a little bit, I guess, what the professor was saying before. We hear about all these theories and everything that needs to be done, and we know what needs to be done. But then when immigration issues happen and people are on the streets marching and the actual issues are out there, why the conversation is not really happening at the municipal levels, at the level where people can be really educated and not wait for a crisis?
And we'll take another question from Miriam.
Just to add on the previous question, I wonder to what extent we have removed the politics out of our professional practice, and I'm particularly talking about planning, and in an effort to gain professional recognition, we have moved to a technocratic domain that takes the politics out of our planning practices, and to what extent that is even embedded in our academic domain. This is a particular reality, what we have here. We have broken a bunch of boundaries. We are engaged and very loose about how we listen to each other, and I really appreciate the comments that the panel made about that openness, which doesn't happen every day. But as it was pointed out, we function within institutions where you're supposed to respond to very specific theoretical constructs within your field, and you get a specific points for the publications that you get within a specific journals. So those challenges are huge, and not only as scholars who are trying to produce and function in academia, but the way we translate that then to the students, and the way the students, not about what they learn, but what they end up losing by navigating our academic domains. And I wonder to what extent then this depoliticization is not just in a planning practice, but to some extent within our academic domain, which ends up constraining this kind of very fruitful dialogue, but that doesn't happen. It's not common in our intellectual domains.
My question would be very different. It seems that to talk about transnationalism, we have talked most of the time about local places, like about local case studies. And somehow I had the intuitive aim to have found about an analysis that, or to talk about policies or advocacy that has to enact, that has to act in two places at the same time. So it's transnationalized, because in many of the cases it seems that for a given case study there should be something done there, so there is a kind of national policy that acts transnationally in a national territory. And the idea of acting transnationally makes me think that if it is possible to think about transnational policy in planning, and if it is possible, how would that differ from international planning policy?
I think we'll probably take a moment to answer those questions before we move on. So probably let's start with the first two, the theory and practice questions. whoever wants to answer them, and then we'll move on to Alejandro's. Tom,
Okay.
do you have something to say?
Well, you just asked the right question for me. I face this daily. I teach in a university, and I feel that I'm surrounded by people who use interdisciplinarity all the time and talk about it. But when I go out and do it, I'm the first to get hit over the head, okay? Secondly, people also talk about practice all the time and integrating theory and practice. And I go out and do it, and I pay for it. So our institutions are hypocritical. I find interdisciplinarity to be actually on the wane. We lost our Latin American Studies program, and other Latin American Studies is dwindling, I thought, nationally. I think it is true, and I think it is unfortunate that you have to take international planning. In the United States, I find this an incredible, we have a discussion going on in our department now about whether to create international studies concentration. And I'm sorry, I disrupted the whole faculty meeting when I said, I don't know what the hell you're talking about. What is international? What isn't international? And in New York City, in the most powerful country in the world, what isn't international? And I think it goes back to this idea. I think when I was talking about multiculturalism, what I really meant to say was multiculturalism has become the international branding for U.S. capital around the world. We are a multicultural empire. And so our cities have a multicultural face, but it's all Disney World, you know, Epcot Center. It's all a performance put on with the exterior qualities of cultures that has very little to do with the essence of the cultures and the people in the cultures also. And just look at the 2012 Olympics in New York City, the way it was branded and the publicity around it. It was the assimilationist dream, this wonderful melting pot of happy people from all over the world who lived in harmonies, who joined arms and sang Kumbaya. I live in New York. That's not the way the city works, okay? So I think we have a lot to do. And by swimming against the current, though, within our academies and outside. And I guess the last thing that relates to the last question, because maybe then I won't comment on that, is how to deal with transnationality. I think the question that has to be asked, first of all, is whose transnationality? Transnational what? Labor, capital, culture? What are we talking about? Everything moves, everything's part of global networks, but not all transnationalities are the same or equal.
So can I follow up just my, so one of the questions that I hear sort of posing in this event is a question, is the production of transnational urban space the Da Vinci Code, you know, that is going to solve this riddle of how do we do politics, you know, local, the politics of knowledge production, and you know, and I just want to highlight that, you know, like this is one of the themes that I hear, like, you know, what would that look like, you know, if in fact the claims that we're making are accurate and so on. I do also want to make like what I hope like Liam would accept as a friendly amendment when you say like change would only happen within interdisciplinary collaborations, but I don't want to lose track of the political aspect of these disciplines. Like, you know, sort of like when you look at the history of ethnic studies, in fact, comes out of like struggles of students shutting down campuses. So And this is to me one of the virtues of critical theory. Whatever permutation or flavor you want to use for this, but it's problematizing the knowledge production with the agents producing it and how they're implicated in that very framework. So I guess like my friendly amendment to the vision of interdisciplinary collaboration is that it has to be supported by some kind of politics. At the end of the day, these departments it's not a question of brilliant papers back and forth. And I'm old enough that I remember when some of those fights were going on, and now with rising tuition across the nation, I think it's fair to assume like we're going to see another generation of student social movements fighting for their education and so on and so forth. But I do not want to lose track of the political aspect that is embedded in part in the very concept of knowledge production.
And just to, I'm sorry, were you going to say something? And just to add to that, I think the first question about why aren't planners more educated about these issues, I think because planners in general and planning academics aren't challenged either by students because our planning schools are quite frankly very homogenous. Only about now I haven't looked at the latest ACSP figures, Association of Collegiate Schools of Planning, but only in the 2008 numbers, only about 7% of the student population in planning schools was Latino. How many Latinos do you know of that are executives of planning firms? How many can you name that run planning firms, that run planning organizations in New York, in the New York area, which has the most diverse labor pool perhaps in the country, except for maybe Los Angeles? So there's not that challenge either from the employers or the students, and I think this is going to continue because and this is continuing on the criticism of planning schools, is that the traditional planning curriculum of the full-time daytime program, which I know there are programs that aren't, tends to be biased towards people with wealth and time, which means that to the extent that that's correlated with race and income, it means that you're going to have greater homogeneity in your planning schools. The other thing about removing politics, I think the reason is, and this goes back to the heuristics of planning, to the mindset, that planning, whether it's organizational planning, urban planning, is all about managing risk and reducing risk. I mean, that's why you plan. Immigrants, the other, in quote, is risk. So as Tom said, one way you could deal with it, is to Disneyfy them, as is done in Astoria with Greek communities, with Little Italy. And if they're not Disneyfied, then they're scary, like in Oyster Bay, where they produce regulations that I think I forget what the official name is, but it's locally known as waving while Latino. This gets into, and the issue of politics, what happens is planners wind up falling back into using racially neutral language, technocratic language, because in many cases it's disturbing to deal with the challenges, deal with the risks of immigration, of dealing with the other. And as we've seen time and time again, whether it's with a supermarket in Orange County, where a Latino-themed supermarket was denied an application, while a more generic anglicized supermarket, or in Mount Laurel, in New Jersey, where racially neutral language was used effectively to prevent African Americans from moving to the community. We see that time and time again, and what happens is I think many planners, because they're not challenged in their own schools, in their own training, they do not become, a lot of them do not become reflective enough to say, wait a second, I'm a good hard person, I'm a good progressive, yet the actions I take, the work I do, seems to perpetuate institutional racism.
Thank you. We have about 5 minutes left, so I'm going to ask if you have any more questions. There's a question. Oh, did,
No, I think there was another question, wasn't it? The transnational policy,
yeah.
national policy.
So we'll, okay. Should we combine questions? Okay. Do you want to address the question now?
Oh, no, it wasn't.
Okay, and
I
we'll
think
move on.
I was just saying that there was
Okay,
a
there
question
was-
about national policy.
there was.
I don't know if anybody wants to.
The different levels of policy.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you want to ask your question? And then we'll
Yeah, I'm not sure how to ask it, and I'm trying to think about a number of the comments that have been made, but I'm really interested in the places where we can't fuse Latino and Latin American studies very easily, and I think it draws upon some of the comments that were made. I think, you know, if we think about Latino studies and ethnic studies, they definitely emerged out of critical social movements. And Latin American studies, area studies, it came out of the Cold War. And these are very different formations, and I think have had very, very different histories. And I'm really struck by this comment of the dissolution of Latin American studies precisely at the time where you see more queer critical theorists, more people of color doing and engaging race and a lot of the important critical theory work that has been done, and using that from Latino studies and really implementing that in Latin American studies. You see that at LASA, and why is it now that this is dissolving, right? So these kinds of articulations. But I also think that there's something about this question that spills out into kind of question of public space. I mean, I think that the containment of knowledge, and I do see a reaction in disciplines. I'm, you know, trained as a sociologist, and there's a real reactionary strand towards interdisciplinarity there. Again, precisely at the time where we're making inroads in kind of creative political thinking and engagements, I think it's analogous in some ways to this management of capital of spaces. But I am heartened by the comment that I think we will see in reaction to the dismantling of something like the UC system, or, you know, a kind of real engaged social movements that spill out and exceed. And I think that that's true of public space. I mean, a lot of it, the spaces of segregation they bleed in certain places. So it's not really, I mean, I'm trying to cull together this and think through where we can actually learn from the kind of questions and coupling of knowledge and power, the kind of racialization practices that are, you know, done and carried out by the state, and how this is somehow says something about the work of planning. And I guess, you know, I think there's some overlap. I just don't know how to put it all together.
Thank you. We'll take one more, and I think that's going to be our last.
Well,
There's two more questions.
I think, just to briefly comment on that, I think there's an opportunity there to in the dissolution of Latino studies, there might be an opportunity to create a different sort of pedagogical reality within departments that doesn't relegate Latino studies to one person. Because usually what happens is, you know, oh boy, we're going to get accredited, and we really need to fill this check mark here that deals with, you know, either, well, it could be Latino, but I don't know that the planners have a Latino check mark, but it's probably non-Western. You probably have a non-Western check mark, and then it's we need to hire somebody in this line. So immediately the entire faculty gets kind of exempt from the need to actually think about the problem and to re-educate themselves. And there's a kind of tokenism that takes place. You know, this is the non-Western person, this is the Latino studies person, or whatever. And so if there is a kind of, you know, reorganization of the university in the sense that the certain departments are getting cut out, then, you know, it's an opportunity also to make claims for the re-education of, you know, entire faculties. I mean, because ultimately that's what's at stake, it seems to me, you know, and so there would have to be more teacher training seminars, conferences that deal with, you know, how do you teach your subject in a way that it incorporates, you know, some of the theoretical contributions that Latino studies have made to the field, so that it, you know, you see what I mean? That that would be, I know that sounds kind of like an impossibility, But there might be an opportunity there to make that claim.
And I'd just like to add, which I always think, is that when we're talking about transnationalism, I would like to, I like the idea of the Latino centers being dispersed and entering other areas. That might have other implications, like practical implications to how the studies of Latin America or Brazil with all its complications happen in the US. But at the same time, I'm much more interested in knowing, for example, what is happening to the transportation system in the Mekong Basin, and how can I compare that to the transportation system in the Amazon Basin with, like, you know, and think about a more transnational comparative world in which we could see political spheres which don't only segregate, well, these are the Latino, and the Latino have to talk about Latin America, and the Asians about the Asian. Everybody like talks with the Western European and US to ask, well, where should we go? That's one aspect of it.
Kind of bilateralism that needs to be put into question.
And at the same time, what Tom said and he said is like, there is still this monoculture, even though, and very strongly. And invisibility is incredible. How you have schools are a very good example, because they're in New York City, they're extremely diverse, but the teachers are all American. And they're not prepared to understand diversity. You know, poor teachers. But, and the political sphere, the sensation we have here in the US, that the political sphere after 9/11 and all the consequences, it has to be refound somewhere. You know, I'm waiting for riots about the G train that Bloomberg is gonna close, and I haven't seen the riots, you know. It's like, come on, high school kids, aren't you gonna break the trains, you know? It's not that you should, but where are the riots? Like, CUNY had a big, I don't know what happened yesterday. Yeah, finally. So, how is the political sphere gonna be refound, or political, not governmental, public sphere refound in America, maybe?
Well, the rally at Hunter College against the cutbacks at CUNY was very lively yesterday, but it was also very frightening to see the police presence for the first time post 9/11. You begin to see the challenges ahead. I actually think your question, you know, about how actually interdisciplinary studies and the demand for faculties to break out of their disciplinary silos came from student protests from the 1960s and 70s. It came from the civil rights movement, the peace movement, and their presence on campuses. And that's where I would put my hope, that there are people who are more able to and willing to take action on the political issues of the day, like the students are doing today. Because what's happening in our public university is it's slowly and tortuously being privatized. And you know, I don't have any great love for the old Latin American studies programs, because, you know, they were started after the Cuban Revolution, funded by Ford and Rockefeller, to prevent other revolutions. And Latin American Studies Association began with a core membership of a lot of the State Department people who were out there to use the Alliance for Progress to prevent other Cubas. So today, the Latin American Studies Association is is changing in very important ways, but it's also a reflection of the changing political process in Latin America, which is no longer under the complete hegemony of the United States. And this is, you know, until a few years ago, the Lhasa Forum, which is the magazine, was all English, and now it's multilingual. These are expressions of some grassroots changes that are, I think, very important, but they're going against the current. And in the United States, the U.S. is more like a fortress that's closing its walls closing to protect its dominant culture economy, and losing power and influence around the world. So this is the environment in which we're operating. So I'm actually optimistic that, in some way, that we will get out of this. In the U.S., we're facing some very frightening days and dangerous days. As I see the university being militarized, our public schools being taken over by police, taking kids away in handcuffs. This is a serious threat to everything that this, the democratic process that we are supposed to have been committed to.
Thank you. We are unfortunately out of time, so I'm going to ask the panelists if they have anything else to say. That's 30 seconds or less. Tom and Gotti's 30 seconds, and we'll end there. I know there are some really important questions that continue to need to be raised, and I think that these are really important conversations we're having. So I'll have the panelists have anything pressing that they've sort of felt was an incomplete thought that they wanted to.
I do have a process, and I mean no disrespect to you, but Teresa has been raising her. I just wonder if you could ask her question. So can I give her my 30 seconds or so?
Sure.
You yield your things. You yield your time.
Plaza was like Plaza Mexico, but it was appropriated, so that's good. So my question is, it seems that transnationalism is restructuring globally, locally, at all levels, and a lot of scales. So in terms of class, race, and gender. And I would like you to respond how that restructuring is going to inform our action, at the personal level, at the job, at the education, at the academia, at housing, at the level of rights, at the level that you want to respond. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, yes.
Tatiana kind of already broached it, so maybe it's a thought for next time we all get together. But is really that question of the sort of bilateral conversation, and really thinking about what would a conversation be, or what should the conversation be between Latino studies and African American studies and Asian American studies and Native American studies, because it's happening on the ground. So how are we thinking about it academically? How are we thinking about it pedagogically? Really putting different multi-transnational groups into conversation with each other.
Thank you.
Thank you. I guess if there are any brief responses to those issues that were raised. No?
I mean, you used my face, not just kidding. Like, no, thank you. Yes, I mean, how can I say? Yeah, absolutely. I agree.
I think that was an excellent note to end on. Thank you so much.
I think there is one forum I'll just mention. You all know the World Social Forum is one of the most important forums, I think, for carrying on those discussions and dialogues. And if you've participated in any one of them, you know how difficult those dialogues can be, which just is the challenge that we face.
And I should add that Latinos in Planning is meant to be a forum to discuss these issues and connect theory and practice. In fact, some of us who've spoken in the past 2 days are working together on a book that deals with some of these issues. And in terms of the dialogues, I know that Latinos in Planning is one of several population divisions within the American Planning Association, and Latinos in Planning is working very closely with Planning in the Black Community Division. It's reaching out to other divisions such as Indigenous Plan Network. In fact, one example is in the National Conference in New Orleans, there's going to be a discussion about race and planning related to, because as we know in New Orleans there's been an increase in Latinos since Hurricane Katrina. So I'd encourage all of you who are interested in planning practice and having a transformative effect on planners to be involved with Latinos in planning.
Thank you.
Well, actually, the conference is from April 10th to 13th. The Planning of the Black Community is actually doing a conference prior to the national conference. So it's whatever the 2 days before then going to happen. And Latinos in Planning always does a tour of a Latino neighborhood in whatever city. So if you're down in New Orleans, please join us on the tour.
Thank you. I think we'll end there. I just want to say this has been a really wonderful conference, and on a really personal note, I think it's really important to thank Clara. This is the first time in my long personal history of Columbia University and my history as a student here at Columbia that these doors have been opened and these questions have been raised. So I think it's really important to acknowledge that. Thank you.